Good afternoon and welcome back to Tactics Board. It's been a rare week without any championship action in the middle of it, but Norwich City face Preston at Carrow Road this weekend, and I'm going to bring you a tactical preview and my predicted starting 11 for the game. Now, the first thing that's worth considering is Preston's form going into it. They've lost their last three, and obviously they started the season very well, but in the last couple of months they've seen a decline, probably the like of which Norwich fans saw after Josh Sargent's injury. Hasn't been as much rhyme or reason to that. It just feels maybe like their sort of good luck ran out, and there is always a couple of teams at the top of the championship at the start of the season that you feel might not be able to sustain it. They obviously hope that they do, and that was the feeling within the Preston camp at the start of the season, but they come into this game without any real momentum at all. They lost 2-0 to QPR, who were in the relegation zone when they faced them, and they are really struggling for wins at the moment. However, with how Norwich are looking this season and the feeling around them, despite 3 wins in 4, Preston will probably go into this game feeling like it's a pretty good chance for them to end that poor run of form and get a win on the road. Tactically, it will look quite different to City's trip to Bristol on Sunday. Of course, that was more of a possession-based team that they faced. That was what allowed David Wagner to put Kenny McLean in at centre-back, because the striker that they had up there didn't provide much of an aerial threat. None of the team really provided much of an aerial threat, and generally they weren't that reliant on crosses to create chances. In fact, when they went to that sort of mode of creation late on in the game, when they were trying to get the goal that would have meant 3 points for them, that was actually when they were the least fruitful in the 90 minutes, and when Norwich obviously managed to break out and get that goal. This is going to be a very different game. Preston have more direct wingers, the likes of Dwayne Holmes, who probably provide more of an attacking threat in terms of pace and directness. They've also got strikers up there who will certainly provide an aerial threat. Of course, they've got Ched Evans, former Norwich City loanee, who is, I think, 6 foot, a bit more of that ilk. Will Keane, very well known at this level for his sort of physical exploits, if not his goal scoring or technical abilities, but he's done fairly well against Norwich in the past and could start this game. That whole striking department really for Preston, and all the options they have to choose from, provide an aerial threat and will be looking to get on the end of crosses. So that's certainly something for David Wagner to consider. It's probably the sort of thing that the team he's preferred this season will thrive on. Shane Duffy certainly will be more pleased to face attackers who will be more stationary and will look to get on the end of crosses than he will to face strikers who try and get in behind, and that could be a game that suits him or Danny Bart. And of course we'll get on to that starting 11, but it doesn't feel like the sort of game where Kenny McLean could start at centre-back. Wagner was very clear following that Bristol win that the McLean ploy wasn't one that we would see repeated regularly, that it was one based on the team that they faced. And this Preston team don't have those same characteristics at all, especially in attack. So I'll be surprised if Kenny McLean is used there, and of course we'll come on to it, but I expect to see him in midfield. Otherwise, it feels like a decent chance for Norwich to continue their run of good form going into the derby. They've got Sheffield on Wednesday actually, before that game, and they are a team who are rooted to the bottom of the championship. They've picked up a little bit, but that's another game that Norwich should be going into looking like they can get 3 points. So hopefully that Bristol win was the start of a run, although I don't think there's huge amounts of optimism in the fan base at the moment. With the way that Preston are going and how important momentum is in the championship, you'd like to look at this as a decent chance for Norwich to try and get some points on the board. So without further ado, this is the 11 I think Wagner will trust to do it. So I've gone for Angus Gunn in goal, Jack Stacey at right back, Shane Duffy and Danny Bart at centre back, Dimitris Giannoulis at left back, Kenny McLean and Gabriel Sara in midfield, with Jonathan Rowe on the right, Liam Gibbs sort of behind, Ashley Barnes up front, and Ono Hernandez on the left. So in goal, Angus Gunn, and I think you could see the difference that he made. It's one of those things with goalkeepers, you don't really appreciate them until you don't have them, and although George Long did a fairly decent job for most of it, I thought in his last appearance at Watford he really struggled, and I think that allowed Gunn to shine even more probably at Bristol. You could argue he was slightly at fault for that goal. He pushed it straight out for the opener, but other than that, he was absolutely spot on. Really made some key saves at 1-0 to keep Norwich in the game when they probably could have been 2-0 behind going in at half-time. His distribution looked calmer than George Long's, and he just looked overall more of a presence, and he dealt with those crosses that Bristol were putting into the box really well as well. So his addition is a welcome one after coming back from injury, and you absolutely expect to see him in goal, unless obviously there's been an injury, which we're hoping there's not, going into that Preston game. Jack Stacey at right back. I think he's picked up his performances maybe slightly inconsistently in the last few weeks, but he hasn't had a real shocker in a little while. Of course, we've spoken quite a lot about that barren period that he had, but being dropped for Kellen Fisher a couple of times seems to have woken him up. I actually asked David Wagner about that, and he said that when you drop a player, that can actually work in their favour long term, and I think that's the case with Jack Stacey, who seems to have upped his performances, maybe not to the level that he showed when he started the year, but he hasn't had the players around him of the same quality and performing to the same levels that they were back then. So I think some fairly decent performances from him, and he's fairly assured for the next couple of weeks in that right back position. Then at centre back, I've got Shane Duffy, who seems to be undroppable under Wagner. I thought he was okay against Bristol, exposed a couple of times for that lack of pace, but when we're looking at the 11 that Wagner might choose, it's hard to say ever that he's going to be dropped, to be honest, because he is one of the first names on the team sheet, and whether fans like that or not, at the start of the season he looked really good. Now he looks, for me, quite selectively good up against players that run in behind. He really struggles, but when it's sort of head it, kick it, clear it, he does quite well. I still think the distribution could be more considered. He tends to just lump it forward and not really look for a target man to try and hold it up. He just tends to send it into an area, and that's not really good enough when you need to keep the ball enough to make an effect on the game. And if Norwich want to counter, when they win the ball back, that first pass has to be really clever, and it hasn't been enough with these centre-backs. And another person who that's been an issue with is Danny Bart, who again defensively has been pretty good in a Norwich shirt. Similarly to Duffy, struggles with that lack of pace at his age, but again, very trustworthy, head it, kick it, clear it. His timing is impeccable, and I think he's actually performed pretty well, very good in the air. Of course, scored that header against Watford from the corner to open the scoring in just the 3rd minute. So you can't really criticise much of what he's done. You can see why Wagner would want to use McLean to sort of build the play out, but against this physical threat that Preston offer in the box, I think he'll want to have somebody a bit more physical in there, and we know he trusts experience. So I'd put Danny Bart in there. I'd expect to see him in there. They might again struggle with those distribution issues, but that seems to be not a primary concern for Wagner when he looks at those defensive options. So I expect to see Bart in there. On the left, Dimitris Yannoulis, who I thought had a bit of a shocker, to be honest, in the first half against Bristol, miscontrolling balls and really struggling technically, which is the opposite of what we've been saying about him almost throughout his Norwich career, really. It's looked more like defensively and physically he struggled, and then on the ball he's always been reliable. But he struggled with that in the first half, picked it up massively in the second half, and of course went off with that injury. But Wagner hoped it was just a knock, and if it was, then I expect to see him in the team at left back. In the centre of midfield, I've gone for Gabriel Sara and Kenny McLean. Of course, I did speak about why McLean might not be the perfect option at centre-back, with Bart and Duffy in there and with the physicality that Preston offer. But the way that Wagner was speaking about that situation, it sounded like he still expected him to be part of the team, and we know how reliable he's been this season. So, I expect to see Kenny McLean in midfield. Gabriel Sara, I was speaking to Chris Sutton this week, actually, and he sort of suggested again that he wasn't maybe impressed with the physicality or defensive ability of Sara, and I think that's a fair concern at times, but in recent weeks he seems to really have picked up that sort of ability to be in the right place at the right time, and he's broken up a few counter-attacks from opposition teams. And although I'm not sure he is really in his best position in this system at the moment, it sort of is the best fit within the roles that Wagner has available to him, and we know how capable of a player he is on the ball. Again, another fantastic pass that found Yannoulis before that own goal for the equaliser at Bristol. So his individual quality, you absolutely cannot doubt. I feel a little bit for him in this Norwich team, and you feel that Whether it's with Norwich or not, and you sense probably not at the moment, he will probably be in a top division next season. But for now, Wagner gets to enjoy him, and it seems to me absolutely clear that he will start him. Against Preston on the right, I've gone for John Rowe, and the only reason I didn't have him in my lineup for the Bristol game was that there was still that question mark over injury. Of course, he didn't make any benches going into that game, and he looked a little bit tired, to be honest, in the second half. Against Bristol, it wasn't his best performance of the season, but I thought you could still see the up in levels when he was on the ball and how much better he looked than a lot of the players on the pitch. He's not only just good at that sort of direct running and dribbling that I think a lot of people know him for, he also interlinks with players really, really well. His movement is intelligent. He knows when to go inside, he knows when to come outside, and him and Jack Stacey seem to have that understanding. So he can probably play that role even in a passing team. And that was probably the role he played a bit more against Bristol. But if Norwich are going to counter-attack a bit more and probably sit in a low block, as you might expect against this more physical Preston setup, then Rowe's fast running and balance on the ball might be something that they need. So I've gone for him on the right. Liam Gibbs behind Ashley Barnes, and I think Gibbs actually put in a pretty decent performance against Bristol, probably his best since he scored the opener in that 2-0 win over Blackburn back in April. He's definitely struggled at times this season, and he hasn't really looked technically up to the level. He obviously works hard, he has a lot of energy. Wagner has spoken about his speed, and you can see why he's a sort of David Wagner type player. Again, I'm not sure he's in the right position, but I thought he was quite good against Bristol. Based on that start to the season, you'd say, and I would say, to be honest, that it's unlikely he has the consistency to produce that again against Preston, but he was running the channels really well, putting in some effective balls, found Ashley Barnes for one header, set up Ono Hernandez to hit the post, and I actually thought it was a very good performance against Bristol. So for a Wagner favourite, you'd be surprised if he was dropped, although he probably does face some competition from Marcelino Nunez, who I thought put in his most consistent performance for Norwich in over a year against Bristol. One of those you'd have to say looks like they're going to be dropped. However, with McLean likely to come back into the midfield, and it's probably a tough decision for Wagner to make. But just based on the profile of those two players and how much they fit into the system, I'd say Gibbs is probably more likely to stay in the team, as is Ono Hernandez, who really made up for his Watford performance against Bristol. One of the best Norwich players on the pitch throughout the encounter, after a real shocker again against Watford, to be honest. Made almost no positive contribution at Vicarage Road and did very, very well to keep his place in the team, So then he managed to turn it around against Bristol, and I think that was a big moment for him. However, we know how inconsistent he can be, and you can't bank on him going and producing a performance against Preston. However, as we've spoken about, the way that this game is likely to play out might play into his hands. And up front, I've gone for Ashley Barnes, who again I thought improved a little bit, probably not to the levels that you'd hope to see, and he was almost spoken about as this saviour by David Wagner when he returned from injury and when he came back into the team. But I always felt he needed Josh Sargent alongside him to reach those levels that he was before he himself got injured. I asked Wagner that question, and he said Barnes did enough in the games without Sargent to prove that that's not the case. However, I'm not sure I agree with that, and I think he has struggled to make that impact. But against Bristol, getting more on the end of things, got a header to that Liam Gibbs cross I mentioned. There was a lovely pass from Sarah that he chested down and volleyed just over. So he's getting in the positions maybe more so than he was in the last couple of games, and that might be because he started in that number 9 position rather than the sort of number 10 position that he's been starting in most of the time. But I'd expect to see him in that 11 again, because he's so much of a Wagner player, because he brings those intangible qualities that the head coach seems to think are so important. Yes, Adam Idah scored a last-minute winner against Bristol, but that only really reinforced Wagner's belief that he's sort of a super sub and he can play that super sub role. I wouldn't expect to see him starting, because he really struggled in that Watford game to make an impact again from the start of the game. So I'd expect to see him on the bench and Barnes up front. And that's the 11 I think Wagner will go with. Thank you again for joining me on Tactics Board. We've got a fantastic flash sale offer now at pinkun.com/subscribe. You can get 3 months of our premium product for just £3. So that's columns from Chris Sutton, Ewan Roberts, Chris Gorham, loads and loads of subscriber exclusive analysis, Q&As, plenty of good stuff over on the Pinkun Plus app. So go to pinkun.com/subscribe to learn more about that. Thank you again for joining me on Tactics Board, and I'll see you soon.